All right, welcome to the fourth installment of the aggregates, the breakdown of the root of the Heart Sutra, which is the 5 skandhas, 5 aggregates. And we're on number 4, which is Sankhara. Sankhara, to me, is really where the rubber meets the road in deeper realization, specifically how that aggregate interfaces with behavior. My Zen teacher, I really loved this about him. He always related to realization to perfection of the character or refinement of the character. When all is said and done, ultimately this has to be about compassion, about being a better person, about being a less unconscious person, being a less violent person, living in concert and alignment with the Dharma. That was really the gist of his teaching, aside from the insight aspects of his teaching. And I agree. And again, where the rubber meets the road is behavior. How do we move through the world? How do we interact with ourselves and others? So Sankhara, the word is often translated as mental formations or volition. I really like that it is translated as volition. Mental formations, the common sort of connotation or interpretation could be just thoughts, right? The thoughts that just stream through our mind all day long. And it does have to do with that, of course. It is rooted in thought. But volition is key in that volition itself, the experience of volition, in my experience, is not just thought. It's where thought touches sensation. I've said in my book, and I've said in other areas or other conversations, that emotion is somewhere between thought and sensation, or thought and feeling, right? It's kind of the way station or something like that, where you could say an emotion is not just a pure sensation, but it's also certainly not just a pure narrative. Volition, which is closely tied to emotion, of course, volition is exactly where thought and mental formations touch sensation. So I want to explore this in a few different ways, and I also want to give anyone who watches this practical approaches to investigate this themselves. So first, let's just start with looking into your experience of volition. Just feel into it and see, what does it feel like to have an urge to act? What does it feel like to have an urge, whatever urge is in this moment, if there is one, or you can sort of call one in. Remember something recently where you had a strong urge. What does it feel like to have an urge to eat? What does it feel like to have an urge to react? What does it feel like to have an urge to defend yourself? What does it feel like to have an urge to explain yourself? What does it feel like to have an urge to run away? I think, and I feel like I know from experience that as simple as these questions are, just being willing to really explore these in yourself, unpack them, look closely, feel closely, itself is a very potent form of shadow work. Because at some point you will find yourself in this territory. You will find yourself face to face with what feels like volition. Nose to nose. It'll feel powerful. When we talk about this in the Fetter model, we could say that it comes in 2 phases. The first one is Fetter 4 and 5. Fetters 4 and 5 the gross reactivity, which is a reactivity to our perception of external circumstances. It's really our reactivity to the idea that things should be the way we want them, and they're not, right? That's the first level. And it's an important one. And it's often where our gross reactivity is. It's where our major reactions are, where our major life challenges and so forth reside. Our resistance to everything that's going on around us, if there's a lot of gross resistance, that's where you find it. And then the second phase of it is, in one sense, it's more subtle. In another sense, it's as or more intense. Physically, the sensation aspect of it is actually more intense. But the component that is we would attribute to self, or the component we would attribute to identity, is much more subtle. In fact, we often describe it as the ninth fetter, which we are in direct contact with once the eighth fetter drops, which is the self-structure. I want to make a point about this, and it's really important. It's often misunderstood, and that is when the self drops, the illusion of self drops, it doesn't mean that all volition drops. It doesn't mean that all selfishness immediately corrects itself. It doesn't mean that all bad habits suddenly correct themselves. It doesn't mean even that unconsciousness is completely obliterated. It just means that the fundamental illusion, the container that contains all the other fundamental illusions, is dispelled. And so what then happens is all of the forces and tendencies and misperceptions and habit force and all of it that was contained within that self, it doesn't have anywhere to be anymore. It doesn't have anywhere to contain itself. So it really is experienced now as this, what's called energetic restlessness, or rising up, or let's just call it intense energy. And I would call that raw volition in this context. So when we talk about volition, we're talking about a very powerful force, actually. We're talking about where mental formations, or the perspective the mind forms about what's happening right now and what it means and how it plugs into a bigger narrative of self. Where does that come into contact with this sensation field, which when experienced raw and unfettered by the self-fetter, is very intense, because there's no mitigating it anymore by the self or by duality and so forth. So that's where we're at. We're at this volitional threshold, this kind of trying to think of a good description for this. It's kind of the event horizon of selfing. Yeah. A very smart person named John Tan said a while back that just because there's no self doesn't mean there's no selfing. And just because there's no me doesn't mean there's no mine, right? So the habit forces and so forth will be often pretty intact even when the self structure drops. So then you feel the tendency to do the selfing. You feel that strong tendency to reform something that you know can't reform at all, but you still feel the tendency, yeah? That's volition in the way we're talking about it, at least in my experience. So that's why these questions are really helpful, because what they do is they just drop you right in to the immediate perspective, the immediate experience of sensation leading to this sense that I need to do something, right? I have the urge to react, run away, hide, dissociate, eat, lash out, right? Any of these very primal tendencies, have sex, be heard, be seen, be validated, right? Whatever it is. This is where we really start to unhook those self-centered behaviors. The bodhisattva vow, the greed, hatred, and ignorance rise endlessly. I vow to abandon them. This is where you find them. This is where you find them rising, right? That rising up, the ninth fetter. This is the feeling of it. What does that feel like to feel that rising up? And to realize you don't need to rise up, or to realize there's no one there to rise up and there's no need for a reaction. There's no need for even sometimes a response. More importantly, I want to make the distinction between reactivity in the fourth and fifth fetter terminology, and what I mean here when I say to react is there's no need. I'll actually say what it really is to see there's no causal relationship. There's no necessary causal relationship. There's only a habituated causal relationship between sensation and behavior. And by looking closely at this again and again and again, the spell will be broken more and more and more. It will get a lot easier to do this. At first, it may not be easy at all. In fact, you may drop the self-structure and you may find a huge collection of behaviors that may not feel like gross reactivity. You're not actually reacting to, you're not lashing out because the world isn't doing what you want it to, and yet you still feel behaviors that are intact, that are responses to old buried perceptions, traumas, and so forth. Anyone who's been here can relate to this, right? So this is how you unhook it, as you look closely, and most importantly, you feel directly, right? It feels hot, it feels alive, right? Something that wants to react. But even the wanting to react, right, is still, that's the mental formation. It's still something that's there to be investigated. And look closely. If you look closely enough, you'll see it's not a causal relationship. The sensation does not compel behavior, ever, never. Sensation never compels behavior. It suggests behavior, but only through habit force, only through years and years of habit, momentum, let's say. So that's what I think the fourth aggregate is really pointing to, is this volitional tendency. So as I mentioned, just starting out by looking really closely at what does it feel like to want to move toward or move away from even. What does that feel like? And when you're in this territory, when you're in this, I could also call this deep shadow work, because it is deep shadow work. Someone's used an analogy the other day I really liked, and I hadn't heard this, but they quoted Adyashanti, that, it's like a big vat of soup or a big vat of stew. It's like, that's the shadow work, right? And you kind of go down through and it's like, wow, there's so much of this, but you start getting towards the bottom and you sense that you've gone through a lot of it, but now you're starting to scrape the stuff off the bottom that's kind of burnt, been stuck there for a long time, and that you could easily overlook. That's that deep shadow stuff. That's what this feels like. This will feel intense is the best word I can come up with. I don't want to add anything to it by calling it intense, but it often is described as intense. It's very direct. It's very direct, and you can feel that it's the bottom. It's the bottom of that selfing, right? That mass of reactions and reactivity and responses and trauma responses and all of it. You know it when you're there. So that's what we're talking about here. So one thing that can be helpful is to just take a moment and feel into this question and see what it brings up. Can you recall a time recently where you felt some intensity in the body, intensity in your sensation field in regard to a situation, any kind of situation? It could be something that surprised you, something you have to deal with that you didn't want to deal with. Could be things like a health crisis are often good places to look, but could be something to do, often it's something to do with another person, a challenging situation, a partner, someone you're emotionally connected to. These are usually the territory you find this in. So I would suggest everyone here watching this, feel back into that, find that experience. And just bring it into your consciousness, bring it into your field of attention. Feel it. Feel what it feels like to have the sense that I need to do something about this. I need to act. I need to know what to do. Sometimes it's like I don't even know what to do, but I feel like I'm scrambling to figure out what I need to do, right? Something feels urgent. There's an urgency. That's what I want you to notice, the urgency to this. There's a sensation, which could be called intense, and there's an urgency. Okay, the urgency is really where I want you to focus here. And you can apply this, later on when something else comes up. You don't have to do it right now, but this is the practice I want to put forward. When you feel into that urgency, what is the belief there? Why is there an urgency? What is required to experience urgency? Like, can you unpack what urgency even means?